What if Genghis Khan attacked Western Europe instead of China? If Genghis Khan had turned his gaze westward, if, instead of marching toward the rich cities of China, he had cast his ambitions upon the heart of Europe, would we still speak of Rome and Paris? Or would their ruins echo with the thunder of Mongol hooves? History tells us that in the early 13th century, Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan, forged one of the most fearsome empires the world has ever seen. From the wind-swept steppes of Mongolia, his mounted warriors carved a bloody path across Asia, eventually pushing deep into Central Asia, Persia, and the lands of the Jin and Song dynasties in China. His conquests would forever change the face of Eurasia, redrawing borders and collapsing dynasties with brutal efficiency. But despite the vastness of his ambition, one direction remained largely untouched in his lifetime: the full heart of Western Europe. The historical Genghis Khan made limited moves into Eastern Europe. His successors would go further, but China was always his true prize. The wealth of the Middle Kingdom, the ancient grievances with the Jin Empire, and the lure of imperial legacy pulled his armies eastward. Yet imagine, for a moment, if the decision had been different. If, in 1219, after subduing the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis had not turned his eyes to the east, but to the west. If instead of invading the lands of the Shia and the Jin, he had unleashed his fury upon the crumbling remains of the Carolingian dream, the Holy Roman Empire, and the bickering kingdoms of France and England. This single strategic decision, one that could have plausibly been made, changes everything. We begin our divergence in the year 1221. The Khwarezmian Empire lies in ruins. Genghis Khan, triumphant but restless, listens as his generals debate the next move. In one version of our timeline, he returns east to punish the Jin. In our alternate world, he listens instead to Subutai, his brilliant general, who argues that the Western lands, fractured and divided, are ripe for conquest. The spoils of the Islamic caliphates have been immense, but what lies further? Tales of wealth beyond measure across the distant mountains, rumors of knights in metal armor, of castles dotting green hills, and of cities vulnerable from centuries of internecine war. The decision is made. Scouts ride west. Subutai and Jebe, the famed dogs of war, are dispatched ahead to test the strength of the European frontier. What they find is not unity, but chaos. The Holy Roman Empire, fractured and weak under Emperor Frederick II, is mired in power struggles with the papacy. France is licking its wounds from internal conflict, and England is recovering from rebellion and war. There is no united Europe. There are only kings and dukes, ambitious and blind. By 1223, the Mongol vanguard crosses into the eastern reaches of Poland and Hungary. At first, their presence is mistaken for a new wave of nomadic raiders, similar to the Cumans or Pechenegs. But soon the terror spreads. The Battle of Legnica, once fought in 1241 in our timeline, is now moved forward. European knights, armored and proud, charge into battle against an enemy unlike anything they've seen. The Mongols do not fight as men, they fight as ghosts. Arrows fall like rain, feigned retreats turn into traps. Entire armies disappear into the mist. The Mongols win. Word of the slaughter spreads across the continent, faster than any army can ride. Panic grips the courts of Europe. Pope Honorius III calls for a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against these riders from the East who seem sent from hell itself. In Paris, King Philip II convenes an emergency war council. In London, Henry III, still a boy, watches as his regents argue whether the threat is real or another northern myth. But while Europe debates, the Mongols move. By the winter of 1224, Genghis Khan himself arrives in the Carpathians. His armies, now swollen with new conscripts and allies from the east, begin to pour into Hungary and Austria. The Danube freezes, and across the water, the great cities of Europe lie exposed. The fate of the continent hangs in the balance. And yet, this is only the beginning. The winter of 1224 turned the Danube into a glass blade, frozen and shimmering beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. The rivers that once separated east from west no longer mattered. Genghis Khan had arrived, not as a distant rumor whispered across marketplaces, but as a living storm pressing against the gates of Christian Europe. Vienna, the jewel of the eastern frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, stood like a stubborn tooth in the face of the Mongol advance. Snow blanketed its ramparts. Its people, proud and unyielding, believed their stone walls and iron gates would hold, as they had against Magyar and Turk alike. But they had never faced an enemy like this. Genghis did not simply march, he prepared. Surrounding villages were razed with surgical precision, denying the defenders food, refuge, and information. Mongol engineers, masters of siegecraft learned from Chinese and Persian captives, began constructing trebuchets and siege towers with frightening speed. Their precision was matched only by their ruthlessness. Prisoners from the Hungarian campaigns were forced to labor on the siege lines. Those who refused were crucified within sight of the city walls. Inside Vienna, panic brewed beneath the thin veil of confidence. The Duke of Austria, Leopold VI, called upon the Holy Roman Emperor for aid. But Frederick II was thousands of miles away in Sicily, entangled in disputes with the Pope. No help would come. The only reinforcement was fear. On the morning of January 9th, 1225, the siege began. A storm of firebombs, arrows, and boulders tore through the outer districts. The Mongols advanced in calculated waves, testing the defenses like a predator probing its prey. Each failed assault was a lesson learned. Each night, their siege engines crept closer. The defenders fought valiantly. Crossbowmen on the walls took their toll. Boiling oil, rolling stones, and countermines pushed back waves of attackers. But the Mongols adapted. They built earthen ramparts to protect their sappers. They shifted their attacks to the city's water supply. Disease followed, creeping into the cramped quarters of the Viennese with cruel indifference. Weeks passed, then a breakthrough. On February 14th, under the cover of a snowstorm, a section of the southern wall collapsed. A tunnel, meticulously dug beneath the foundations, had finally undermined the stone. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Mongol cavalry flooded through the breach like water through a broken dam. Streets ran red. The cathedral bells rang out one final time. Then silence. Genghis Khan entered Vienna, not as a conqueror seeking tribute, but as a war god reshaping the world. The city was sacked with brutal efficiency. Libraries were burned, churches desecrated, nobles executed or enslaved. Survivors were herded into pens. Those deemed valuable artisans or skilled laborers were spared. The rest vanished into the snow. The fall of Vienna sent shockwaves across the continent. For the first time, the crowned heads of Europe realized they were not facing another incursion. They were witnessing the beginning of a new age. The Mongols were not content with the spoils of war. They were builders of empire, wielding not only sword and bow, but mathematics, logistics, and espionage. In Paris, King Philip II ordered the walls of the city doubled in height. Messengers galloped to Rome, Madrid, London, begging for unity. Yet the old rivalries remained. Frederick II refused to abandon his war with the papacy. England was embroiled in domestic strife. France hesitated, unsure whether to fight or fortify. Only one man acted swiftly, King Andrew II of Hungary, mourning the fall of his daughter's Austrian homeland, rallied what remained of the Central European nobility. By spring of 1225, the Mongols turned their eyes north and west. Prague, Nuremberg, Regensburg, all glittered on their horizon. But Genghis Khan did not rush. He left Vienna in the hands of a trusted general and moved to establish a command center deeper in Europe's heartland. From this base, he could send envoys bearing demands for surrender or promises of annihilation. Most European rulers, accustomed to slow-moving threats, failed to comprehend the speed of the approaching doom. And so the tide rose. Mongol scouts reached the outskirts of Bavaria. German peasants, hearing the tales, fled their villages. Rumors spread like wildfire. Cities where entire populations were erased overnight. Knights impaled on the ruins of their own castles. Monasteries left as scorched skeletons. But perhaps the most terrifying tale was this. The Mongols did not simply conquer. They absorbed. Mercenaries and exiles, mercantile networks, roads and scribes, they turned the tools of civilization into engines of conquest. By midsummer, Prague surrendered without a fight. Its leaders, having witnessed the fate of Vienna, opened the gates and pledged fealty. In return, the city was spared. But it was not free. Mongol tax collectors moved in, garrisons were installed, and a new governor was appointed, one who spoke both Mongolian and Latin. A new kind of rule was emerging, one that didn't just kill Europe's kings, but replaced them. And in the shadows of Cologne, a cloaked rider watched as Mongol patrols approached from the east. His name would be remembered as the last hope of Christian resistance. But would he be enough? The man in the shadows was Hermann von Salza, Grand Master of the Teutonic Order. A warrior monk, diplomat, and veteran of the Crusades, Hermann had seen the bloodied dunes of the Holy Land and the treachery of courts in Rome and Constantinople. But nothing he had witnessed compared to the terror that now poured into the heart of Christendom. He had ridden west from Bohemia through forests choked with ash and silence, villages abandoned, priests hanging from their own bell ropes. He had come to warn Cologne, not just of an army, but of an ending. The old Europe, the Europe of kings and popes, was crumbling, and in its place was rising a new order, one born of hooves, arrows, and a fury that could not be reasoned with. By autumn of 1225, the Mongol presence in Central Europe was no longer a campaign, it was an occupation. From Vienna to Prague, they established a network of fortified posts and communication routes, stretching like veins into the continent. Their messengers, changing horses every 20 miles, could relay orders from Genghis Khan in days, while European kings waited weeks for scattered reports from distant fronts. In Aachen, the supposed capital of Charlemagne's legacy, the cathedral bells rang not for mass, but for alarm. The Mongols were approaching the Rhine. But this time, they met resistance. Hermann von Salza had not come alone. In the months since the fall of Vienna, he had rallied what few military orders remained intact, remnants of the Templars, Hospitallers, and his own Teutonic Knights. They were joined by mercenaries from Flanders, Saxon militias, and disillusioned nobles who no longer believed the Holy Roman Emperor would protect them. Together, they formed what would become known as the Rhine League, an alliance not of kingdoms, but of survivors. Their strategy was unlike anything Europe had tried before. Instead of meeting the Mongols in open fields, where speed and feigned retreats spelled doom, they turned to attrition. Forest ambushes, supply raids, fortified choke points along rivers. They studied the Mongols, adapted to their rhythm, and most importantly, learned to wait. And yet, even this resistance came at a terrible cost. In the winter of 1225, the Mongols laid siege to Regensburg, a trading hub on the Danube. Unlike Vienna, Regensburg had prepared. Citizens had stockpiled food, reinforced its walls with earthwork, and trained every able-bodied man and woman. But Genghis Khan had learned too. This time, he used plague. Captured rats from the east, infected with a deadly fever, were catapulted over the walls. Within weeks, half the city burned not from fire, but from within. When the gates finally opened, the Mongols did not enter in fury, but in silence. The defenders were already dead. It was not conquest, it was extinction. Elsewhere, Genghis pressed his advantage. His generals, Subutai in the north, Jebe in the west, pushed along the Rhine and Moselle. Fortress after fortress fell. The Black Forest became a graveyard of retreating knights. The road to Paris was opening. But within the Vatican walls, another kind of battle raged. Pope Honorius III had called for a council of emergency. Cardinals from across Europe gathered to debate what must be done. Some argued for total crusade, a united front of every Christian state against the Mongol threat. Others, secretly, considered negotiation. Could the Khan be converted? Could Rome buy peace with gold and tribute? The most shocking proposal came from Cardinal Rodrigo of Castile. Surrender the eastern provinces. Abandon Austria, Bohemia, even parts of Germany. Concede them as a buffer, and protect the soul of Western Christendom. The room fell silent. No one dared to speak the truth. Perhaps Europe could not be saved. Perhaps it could only be delayed. But salvation, for the moment, came not from Rome, but from the north. In a monastery near Bremen, a messenger arrived with word that changed everything. A fleet of Norse ships had been spotted landing in Friesland. Not raiders, but warriors. Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, responding to calls from their Christian brethren. These were the sons of men who once sacked Paris, now seeking to defend it. Under King Valdemar II of Denmark, the Viking legacy would rise once more, not to conquer, but to protect the dying light of Europe. And in Paris, as the first Mongol scouts reached the Marne River, a young commander named Charles of Anjou began to organize the last stand of the Capetian crown. The clash was coming. East met West before, but never like this. And high above the battlefield, the Khan prepared a new strategy, one that would strike at the heart of Europe, not through swords and fire, but through faith and fear. The winter of 1226 brought with it not just snow, but whispers. Whispers of cities vanished overnight. Whispers of Mongol commanders who could read Latin. Whispers that the Pope had already fled Rome. But beneath those whispers was something darker. Doubt. Doubt in kings. Doubt in God. Doubt in the very foundation of Europe. Genghis Khan, the master of not only battle but perception, understood this. His victories had not just been on fields of war, they had been inside the minds of his enemies. He did not merely defeat armies, he unraveled civilizations. And now, with Paris in his sights, he prepared to do something no Mongol had yet attempted: psychological conquest on a continental scale. He began with the monasteries. In early 1226, his envoys arrived at the Abbey of Cluny, robed in Christian garb, bearing Latin scrolls and speaking with strange accents. They carried letters from Khan of Khans, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. The abbots were promised safety, wealth, even expansion of their lands, if they would serve as loyal scribes and scholars under a new imperial order. Some refused. They were never heard from again. Others accepted, quietly, reluctantly. But word spread that the Khan respected monks, that he offered peace to the learned, that perhaps this storm from the east was not the Antichrist after all, but an instrument of divine punishment against Europe's corruption. In Rome, Pope Honorius III could feel his authority slipping like water through stone. The College of Cardinals fractured. Some urged immediate alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, even if it meant ending the papal imperial feud. Others secretly communicated with Mongol agents in Genoa and Marseille. Rumors swirled that a bishop in Toulouse had already converted to the Mongol cause. But as the church trembled, France stood defiant. Charles of Anjou, youngest son of King Louis VIII, had never expected command. But as his elder brothers clashed with nobles in the south, the burden of defending Paris had fallen upon him. And he rose to meet it. He conscripted not just knights, but blacksmiths, farmers, masons, anyone who could wield a weapon or build a wall. He recruited Saracen engineers, hired with gold from the royal treasury, to teach the Parisians how to resist Mongol siege tactics. The city became a fortress. Bridges were torn down to slow cavalry. Sewers were reinforced to prevent undermining. Bell towers were fitted with signal fires. Every man knew his post. Every child knew where to run. But Charles also understood one deeper truth. Walls alone would not save Paris. Ideas would. He ordered sermons throughout the city, not of despair, but of destiny. That Paris was not merely a city, it was the soul of Europe. That if it fell, the continent would become a graveyard of memory. That this was their Thermopylae, their Jerusalem, their last chance. And then, it came. April 1226. The Mongols reached the Seine, from the heights of Montmartre. Oh, scouts could see the glint of thousands of helmets, hear the thrum of war drums in the distance. Fires dotted the horizon. The vanguard had arrived, led not by Subutai or Jabei this time, but by a new figure. Batu, grandson of Genghis, already blooded in the Carpathians. Young, ruthless, and eager to carve his legacy into the flesh of the West. His orders were clear: do not destroy Paris. Take it whole. Make it a jewel in the Khan's crown. But Paris would not fall so easily. On the second day of siege, Mongol archers rained arrows upon the eastern wall. The defenders answered with bolts and boiling oil. Siege towers rolled forward, only to be consumed by fire traps laid by the Saracens. Every assault was met with fury. On the fifth day, Mongol engineers tried to flood the lower wards by diverting the Seine. But Charles had anticipated this. Sandbags, reinforced docks, and water gates held strong. On the ninth day, Batu sent a messenger to the gates. He offered terms: surrender, and no blood would be spilled. Resist, and the children of Paris would forget what sunlight felt like. Charles answered by sending back the Mongols' own messenger, nailed to his horse, dead. The siege intensified. For weeks, the Mongols battered the walls. They built ramps, dug tunnels, catapulted burning pitch. But Paris endured. And then came the turn. On the 24th day, just before dawn, the defenders launched a surprise sortie through the Saint-Denis Gate. Over 800 men, knights, militiamen, even priests with swords, stormed the Mongol supply lines. They burned siege weapons. They set fire to grain stores. They captured 3 captains alive and hung them from Notre Dame's towers. It was the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered in the West, and it changed everything. In the East, Genghis Khan received word of the failed assault with cold silence. He did not rage. He did not blame. He adapted. Paris had shown resilience, but resilience could be broken, not with fire, but with famine, not with arrows, but with poison. And as the Khan prepared his next move, a message arrived from the north that shocked even him. The Norse fleets had not come to raid, but to invade. Under the banners of the White Cross, thousands of Scandinavian warriors had landed on the Dutch coast and begun moving south. Their destination, Paris. A convergence was coming. 3 powers, Mongol, French, and Norse, would soon collide. And beneath it all, in the libraries of Paris and the monasteries of Rome, a new idea began to take root. Perhaps Europe did not need kings. Perhaps, to survive this apocalypse, it needed something more ancient and more revolutionary. The summer of 1226 was not a season. It was a reckoning. Across the scorched fields of northern France, 3 flags now drifted in the wind, each a symbol of survival, conquest, and destiny. The black standard of the Mongol horde, its horsehair fringes soaked in blood. The golden fleur-de-lis of the Capetian crown, torn and weathered but still defiant. And, arriving like ghosts from a forgotten age, the white raven banners of the Norse. From the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the icy shores of Denmark, they had come, not as pagans, but as Christians reborn, descendants of raiders now called to defend the heart of a continent that once feared them. At their helm was King Valdemar II, Valdemar the Victorious, whose sword had once carved borders through the Baltic, and who now stood ready to face the greatest threat Europe had ever known. But this alliance was not born of unity, it was born of desperation. Charles of Anjou met Valdemar not in a grand hall, but on a battlefield still soaked with the blood of Mongol scouts. Their armies encamped on opposite sides of the Marne River, each suspicious of the other's intent. The language barrier, the memory of ancient raids, the pride of kings, all threatened to undo their fragile coalition. It was a monk named Brother Alain who bridged the divide. A former missionary to the Rus, fluent in Old Norse and Latin, he rode between the camps as emissary, mediator, and eventually prophet. He preached of a united Christendom, not under a pope or emperor, but under a single purpose: to survive. And so, under a makeshift pavilion stitched from captured Mongol tents, the Norse and the French bent their pride. They shared maps, coordinated scouts, and planned the defense of Paris, not as 2 kingdoms, but as one line against oblivion. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan prepared his next act with chilling patience. From his mobile court near Frankfurt, he surveyed a map unlike any in Europe. one that marked not just cities, but trade routes, weather patterns, linguistic clusters, and river flow. It was a map of conquest, but also of culture. The Khan understood something his enemies did not. To hold Europe, he would need more than fear. He would need control. And so, he unleashed his secret weapon. From the east came a man known only as the Gray Scribe, a Persian convert to the Mongol cause, trained in law, administration, and philosophy. His mission was simple: rewrite Europe from the inside. In the towns already conquered, Vienna, Prague, Regensburg, the Gray Scribe introduced new legal codes based on a fusion of Mongol yasa and local custom. Taxes were restructured, corruption punished, markets protected. Even Jews and Muslims, long persecuted, were granted limited autonomy, provided they swore loyalty to the Khan. The result was startling. Some cities welcomed their new rulers: order where chaos had reigned, food where famine had lingered, justice swift and impartial. This was not a scorched earth, it was a slow, strategic assimilation. But not all bent the knee. In the heart of the Black Forest, a resistance grew. Nobles without land, peasants with nothing left to lose, mercenaries without pay. They formed into bands, unpredictable, vicious, invisible. They called themselves the Thorned Crown, and their symbol was simple: a broken crown wrapped in barbed wire. They struck at Mongol patrols, poisoned wells, burned supply caches. For the first time, the Khan's messengers began disappearing before reaching their posts. It was not a war. They could not win a war. It was an infection, a cancer under the skin of empire. In response, Genghis ordered the creation of the Red Circle, an elite corps of infiltrators, trained not just in war, but in mimicry, language, and interrogation. Their task? Identify, infiltrate, and eradicate all forms of rebellion before they could spread. Europe was no longer a battlefield. It was a chessboard, and while the pieces moved, the people suffered. In the villages between the Loire and the Rhine, crops lay trampled, churches looted, families torn between allegiances. To fight the Mongols was to risk annihilation. To serve them was to betray everything sacred. Caught in this limbo, many fled to the mountains, the marshes, the sea. It was in Brittany, among windswept cliffs and ancient druidic stones, that another kind of resistance was born, not of swords, but of words. A young woman, Aveline de Carnac, daughter of a minor noble family slaughtered by a Mongol patrol, began to write. Her letters, copied in secret and carried by couriers, spoke not of kings, but of people, of the right to live without foreign rule, of a Europe where faith did not serve crowns, but the conscience. Her writings spread like wildfire. Even in Paris, under siege, copies found their way into cathedrals and marketplaces. They inspired riots, songs, whispers of a Europe that could one day be free, not through blood, but belief. The Mongols noticed. By autumn, Aveline was declared an enemy of the state, a bounty placed on her head. But she had already become something more dangerous than a rebel. She had become an idea. And ideas, as even the Khan would learn, are not so easily crushed beneath hoof and blade. As the siege of Paris dragged into its 5th month and winter winds returned with icy vengeance, all eyes turned south, where the Holy Roman Emperor, long silent, had finally begun to move. But not toward the Mongols, toward Rome. And as Genghis prepared to send a second wave into Burgundy, a terrifying possibility emerged. What if Europe's true collapse would not come from Mongol arrows, but from within? The year 1227 dawned not with hope, but with fracture. The continent, though bloodied by Mongol steel, was beginning to splinter along even deeper fault lines. For while the siege of Paris held the attention of every ruler and bishop, a different war, quieter, more corrosive, was being waged in the south. And at its center stood Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, crowned by the Pope himself, yet excommunicated twice over. A man of learning, cruelty, and ambition, Frederick saw in the Mongol invasion not just a catastrophe, but an opportunity. Rome had grown weak. The Pope, now barricaded in Avignon, relied on feudal lords to enforce doctrine. The College of Cardinals was divided, some secretly favoring submission to the Khan to preserve the Church's treasures and autonomy. Others pushed for a holy war that the fractured kingdoms of Europe could no longer afford. Frederick offered a third path. He declared himself Defensor Europae, not as emperor of crumbling states, but as a new Caesar, a unifier of East and West under a rational secular rule. He had no illusions of defeating Genghis Khan on the battlefield. Instead, he envisioned negotiation, accommodation, a divided Europe, yes, but one in which southern Italy, Provence, and the Papal States remained independent and loyal to him. His envoys, cloaked in Sicilian black, made contact with Mongol agents in Genoa and Marseilles. They carried gifts, gold, silk, astronomical charts, and a proposition: let the North burn. Let France and the German principalities fall. In exchange, the South would offer grain, ships, scholars, and peace. The Khan did not reject the offer, nor did he accept it. He simply waited, for Genghis knew that time was now his weapon. The longer the siege of Paris continued, the more Europe would collapse in on itself. Rebellions would spread. Faith would waver. Kings would turn on each other. He did not need to conquer every city. He needed only to break their will. And yet, in Paris, the will to resist refused to die. Charles of Anjou, though weary and wounded, remained unbroken. His alliance with the Norse had evolved from necessity into kinship. Together with King Valdemar, he restructured the defense of the city into a system of rotating watches and emergency relief zones. Underground granaries were established, hidden aqueducts repaired. Even children were given roles: message runners, sentinels, caretakers. But they were running out of time. Batu Khan, furious at his prolonged failure, ordered the construction of the Great Tower, a massive siege engine unlike anything seen before. Built from the bones of previous towers, reinforced with iron and wet hides, it creaked forward like a monster awakened. At its core was a furnace meant to launch molten rock, sulfur, and plague-ridden corpses over the walls. When it fired for the first time, the sound alone made men drop to their knees. Entire quarters of Paris burst into flame. The sky turned black with ash. The Seine ran thick with debris and blood. Disease followed: dysentery, typhoid, rot. And still, Paris endured. But the cost was staggering. By midsummer, half the city's population had perished. Food was rationed to crumbs. Horses were butchered. Dogs disappeared. The dead were burned in mass pyres on the cathedral steps. And yet, amid the horror, something extraordinary happened. Aveline de Carnac, long thought captured or dead, appeared at the gates disguised as a washerwoman. She brought with her not soldiers, but scribes, dozens of them. Monks, scholars, students from across Europe, fleeing the Khan and the emperor alike. With them, they carried parchment, ink, and the first printed copies of Aveline's manifesto, the Charter of the Free Cities. It called for a Europe not of kings or conquerors, but of communities. City-states bound by trade, mutual defense, and local governance. A rejection of both Eastern despotism and Western divine right. The message spread like wildfire. From Ghent to Leon, uprisings began, not against the Mongols, but against their own lords. Citizens refused taxes. Militiamen seized granaries. Some cities even offered conditional alliances to Paris, forming the first outlines of what would one day be called the Continental Pact. The Khan responded with fire. Towns that declared support for the charter were wiped off the map. Entire populations deported eastward. Charter leaders impaled on city walls. The Great Tower was turned northward. Its path now aimed not at Paris, but toward Rouen, Ghent, Bruges. But the flames lit by Aveline would not go out so easily. Even within the Mongol ranks, doubt began to creep in. European conscripts, translators, and engineers, once compliant, now hesitated. Secret meetings, sabotaged orders, delayed shipments. The empire was bleeding, slowly, invisibly, from within. And then, in the final days of summer, beneath the thunder of hooves and the screams of siege, a whisper crossed the camps like lightning. Genghis Khan was dead. He had died weeks earlier, on a hunting expedition near Mainz, killed not in battle, but by a fall from his horse. The news had been kept secret by his generals, fearing disorder. But secrets, like empires, do not last forever. The unthinkable had happened. The God King was gone, and with him, the certainty of Mongol victory. But as one sun set, another began to rise. For in the ashes of old Europe, amid fire and famine, a new movement was taking shape, one that neither East nor West could control. And in Paris, as the great tower loomed ever closer, Charles of Anjou stood beneath the blackened sky and made a single vow. If this is the end of the world, then let it end with us standing. The death of Genghis Khan should have shattered the Mongol advance like glass against stone. Instead, it rippled through the empire like a low, rumbling quake, unseen at first, then impossible to ignore. Batu Khan, blood of the great Khan and commander of the Western Front, received the message on a moonless night. Sealed with black wax, it was delivered by a courier whose face bore the exhaustion of weeks in the saddle. The message was brief, final, and without embellishment. The Khan has returned to the eternal sky. The succession must begin. For Mongol tradition demanded it. Every general, every prince of Genghis's blood was to return east for the Kurultai, the great council where the next Khan would be chosen. Even in conquest, the empire remained loyal to ritual. Power was not inherited through blood alone, but through consensus of the warrior elite. Batu knew what it meant. A halt, a fracture, a moment when the Mongol war machine, so precise and inexorable, would pause, however briefly. But timing is everything in war, and in Paris, where the defenders had survived on grit and prayer, this pause was salvation. Batu did not yet retreat, but his movements slowed. Orders became cautious. The great tower stopped its crawl forward. Reinforcements were delayed. Rumors spread in the Mongol camps, of rival claimants, of civil war brewing in the east, of assassins and omens. Charles of Anjou, sensing the shift, acted. He dispatched messengers north and west, calling on the fledgling Continental Pact to seize the moment. Rouen rose in revolt. Ghent declared autonomy. Liège executed its Mongol-appointed governor and raised the charter's flag. Norse ships, now resupplied and reinforced, began raiding Mongol coastal holdings. From the edges of Brittany to the Swiss highlands, the fire of resistance ignited into an inferno. But Charles knew victory could not be won with rebellion alone. So, he made a gamble. He rode from Paris, leaving the city under the command of trusted captains. He and a vanguard of 500 knights rode south under darkness, through Mongol lines toward Avignon, toward the Pope, toward legitimacy. It was a journey laced with peril, Mongol patrols, bandits, even suspicious locals, each turn a risk. But Charles understood what few others dared to admit. Europe could not survive as a fractured rebellion. It needed a symbol, not just a warrior, but a king. When he arrived in Avignon, the Pope was gaunt, sickly, and paranoid. Honorius III had aged a decade in months, haunted by the collapse of his authority and the silence from the East. Yet when Charles knelt before him, not in submission but in unity, the old man wept. In a ceremony hastily arranged in the Cathedral of St. Agricola, the Pope anointed Charles not as prince, not even as king, but as defender of the faith and guardian of the West. It was not a coronation, it was a declaration, and it spread faster than fire. In Cologne, in Lyon, in Bruges, in towns shattered by siege and sorrow, people whispered his name. A new Charlemagne, a warrior of the cross, not bound to Rome or empire, but to survival itself. The charter of the free cities now had a protector. The scattered resistance had a rallying point. And in the East, As Mongol generals debated whether to obey the summons to the Kurultai or press their advantage, a fateful decision was made. Subutai, the legendary general who had once crossed the Caucasus and crushed Rus cities like glass, declared his intention to return to Karakorum. He believed empire must endure beyond conquest. Batu, however, refused. He would stay. Europe was his prize. The unity of the horde began to crumble. What had been a single spearhead now fractured into rival commands. Batu ruled the Western Front. Subutai began his long journey east. Other generals, jealous or fearful, withdrew their forces to secure their own territories. The siege lines thinned, morale cracked. Paris, battered and starved, finally saw the enemy falter. In early winter, a sortie from the city drove back Mongol scouts for the first time in weeks. French and Norse troops pushed beyond the Seine, seizing abandoned supply camps. The Great Tower, once a symbol of dread, was found smoldering and empty. Batu had pulled back, not in defeat, but in uncertainty. But it was enough. On Christmas Day, the bells of Notre Dame rang for the first time in 6 months. Not for mourning, not for warning, but for hope. Still, Charles knew the war was not won. Batu would return. The Mongol grip on Central Europe remained firm. And Frederick II, now styling himself Emperor of the Two Sons, had declared Charles a usurper and heretic. A new front was opening, not east, but south. Europe was not healed. It was mutating. In the universities of Bologna and Paris, debate raged. Who now held authority? The Pope, the Charter, or the sword? In merchant cities like Venice and Florence, deals were struck in candlelit backrooms. Trade with Mongol-occupied Vienna, or support the pact and risk ruin. And in the east, in the silent halls of Karakorum, the Kurultai had begun. The successors of Genghis Khan were gathering. Brothers, cousins, enemies. What came next would decide not just the fate of the Mongol Empire, but the fate of the world. And Charles, defender of the West, knew that if Europe were to survive, it must do more than resist. It must transform. The winter of 1227 to 1228 descended over Europe like a heavy, silent shroud, white with snow, red with memory. But beneath the frozen surface, something stirred. The Mongol siege lines around Paris had retreated, but the scars remained. Walls half collapsed, cemeteries overflowing. The acrid smell of burned flesh still lingering in the wind. Yet amid ruin, Paris had become something new. A symbol. A legend. A beginning. And legends, like empires, have gravity. In Bruges, bakers sold loaves shaped like the Great Tower, now mocked instead of feared. In Prague, poets wrote odes to Aveline de Carnac, comparing her to Joan of Arc centuries before her time. And in Ghent, children played at being Norse shield maidens, defending the free cities with wooden swords and stolen kitchen pots. Europe was dreaming again. But dreams are fragile, and winter, like politics, is cruel. In Sicily, Frederick II was moving. Furious that Charles had been anointed without imperial approval, he declared the Continental Pact illegal and excommunicated its members from his court. He reopened negotiations with Batu Khan, offering southern ports and grain in exchange for a joint campaign to retake Paris, not from the Mongols, but from Charles himself. Batu listened. For weeks, envoys passed between Frederick and the Mongol war camp outside Dijon. The terms were clear: a two-pronged assault from the south and east, dividing pact forces and ending the rebellion before spring. But Frederick had miscalculated. He had underestimated the man Charles had become. In Avignon, Charles convened what would later be known as the Assembly of Free Cities, the first gathering of its kind in European history. Dozens of representatives arrived: merchants from Venice, abbots from Burgundy, aldermen from Cologne, Viking jarls, former crusaders, even Moorish scholars exiled from Cordoba. They spoke in different tongues, but all bore the same burden: survival. And under candlelight, with frost biting through the stone halls, they drafted a document that would echo through centuries, the Pact of Montfort. Its 10 articles were simple, radical, and terrifying to the Old World. That no king held authority without the consent of the governed, that cities could self-govern, levy taxes, and raise militias, that trade routes must be protected as sacred arteries of survival, that religious tolerance, within reason, was necessary for peace, that no lord, prince, or emperor could sell land to a foreign power, that no citizen could be forced into war without representation, that the church must serve the people, not rule them, that all member cities stood in mutual defense against East or West, that knowledge, books, maps, medicine must be preserved and shared, and above all, that Europe must never again belong to empires. The ink had barely dried when the first assassination attempt came. A crossbow bolt, fired from the rafters, missed Charles by inches. The assassin was captured and confessed under torture. He had been paid in Venetian gold, laundered through Mongol hands. It was clear. The alliance between Frederick and Batu was real. The pact had become dangerous. And so, war resumed. By spring, 2 armies moved. Mongol forces from the east under Batu, reinforced with southern mercenaries, and imperial troops from the south, bearing the Black Eagle of the Hohenstaufen. Their goal? Paris. But this time, Charles was ready. He no longer fought as a prince defending a city. He fought as the architect of a new world. The pact had formed a united military council. Troops from 10 cities now stood under one banner. Supply lines were organized with clockwork precision. Engineers from Moorish Spain built reinforced towers along the Seine. Norse fleets blockaded the Rhone. Even monks had taken up arms, wielding maces beneath their robes. In Dijon, the first major clash erupted. It was brutal, muddy, and unlike any battle Europe had seen. Mongol cavalry met phalanxes of Flemish pikemen. Crossbowmen fired from behind barricades of shattered cartwheels. Pact scouts set forest traps, collapsing entire groves onto advancing forces. And in the center, Charles rode with a banner that bore no crown, only a burning tower split in 2. It was not a clear victory. Thousands died. The fields were left black, with ash and frozen blood. But the Mongols withdrew. The Imperials hesitated, and for the first time, the pact stood undefeated. In Karakorum, meanwhile, the Kurultai had failed to unify the empire. Genghis Khan's sons, Ogadai, Chagatai, Tolui, bickered, conspired, and divided territory. Word reached Batu that he had been denied the throne. Rage burned in him, but distance and fatigue tempered his fury. He sent orders to dig in, consolidate, and wait for weakness, but weakness would not come from the pact. It came from Rome. Pope Honorius III, sick and despairing, died in his chambers. His successor, Gregory IX, was younger, more zealous, and uncompromising. He declared both Batu and Frederick enemies of Christendom and issued a new papal bull calling for a general uprising. He called it the Second Deliverance. It was not a crusade. It was an eruption. Peasants rose with pitchforks. Cities that had remained neutral now sent militias to the pact. Even factions within Frederick's court turned against him. And in Palermo, his treasury was seized by rebels demanding loyalty to the charter. The tide was turning. And yet, in the Mongol camp outside Metz, Batu stood before a fire, staring into the embers. He knew this war was no longer about conquest. It was about legacy. He sent a final message east to Karakorum. Europe has become something new. Either crush it now, or it will devour us all. What response would come? Would the East return with fire? Or would the empire begin to fracture beyond repair? And in Paris, as spring flowers rose through soil soaked with old blood, a quiet question began to bloom. Had Europe been broken or reborn? Spring gave way to summer in 1228, but the wars that tore Europe apart were no closer to ending. The continent was a chessboard riddled with competing kings, mercenaries, and insurgents, each playing a deadly game for survival and power. The Mongol Empire, once an unstoppable juggernaut, was now a fractured force, struggling to maintain its grip on the western frontier. Batu Khan, once the fiercest of Genghis's heirs, found himself caught between loyalty to the great Khan's legacy and the brutal realities of European warfare. His generals whispered of rebellion. His troops grew restless. Supply lines from the east were tenuous, stretched thin by internecine conflict at Karakoram, where the Kurultai had selected a weak and indecisive new Khan. In Europe, Charles of Anjou and the Assembly of Free Cities, the architects of the Continental Pact, had transformed from a desperate resistance into a burgeoning political force. Cities across France, Flanders, and the Low Countries began asserting unprecedented autonomy, rewriting their charters to align with the Pact's principles. The idea that sovereignty rested with the governed, not crowned rulers, was taking hold. But such change bred enemies. Frederick II, cornered by internal rebellions and papal excommunication, struck a dangerous bargain. He secretly negotiated with the new Khan in Karakoram, offering support to crush the pact in exchange for recognition as the supreme ruler of Italy and southern Europe. The Pope, Gregory IX, furious at Frederick's treason, launched a propaganda campaign accusing the emperor of betraying Christendom to the heathen Mongols. Meanwhile, the Norse contingent, led by King Valdemar II, grew restless with the slow pace of the siege. The Viking warriors, once raiders turned defenders, urged a bold assault on Mongol supply lines to cripple Batu's forces. Charles, tempered by months of siege warfare, counseled caution, arguing that diplomacy might still hold the key. Yet, the Mongols were not idle. Batu had begun integrating European knights into his ranks, forming mixed units that combined Mongol cavalry speed with the heavily armored shock troops of the West. These units became the spearhead of renewed offensives, pushing the Pact's lines back at key points along the Rhine and Moselle rivers. The Great Tower, repaired and enhanced with European engineering, was poised to resume its deadly work. In the city of Metz, a crucial crossroads, the Pact assembled its greatest army yet. An uneasy coalition of French knights, Norse archers, Flemish pikemen, and mercenaries from the Swiss cantons. They faced Batu's forces in a battle that would decide the fate of the northern front. The clash was brutal. The Mongols unleashed their feigned retreats and encirclements, but the Pact's forces, anticipating such tactics, held firm. Norse longships ferried reinforcements and supplies along the Moselle, turning rivers into lifelines rather than barriers. For days, the battle ebbed and flowed. Knights charged, archers volleyed, and the ground ran red. In the end, the Pact's diverse army held the field. Batu withdrew under cover of night, his forces battered and morale shaken. But victory came at a cost. The siege of Paris remained unbroken. Disease and starvation ravaged the city's defenders. Charles himself was gravely wounded during the battle at Metz, his fate uncertain. And the political landscape shifted again when news arrived that Frederick II's new alliance with the Mongol Khan had fractured under mistrust and intrigue. Karakoram was falling apart. Factions vied for control, and the new Khan, unable to command loyalty, faced rebellion from his own brothers. In the vacuum, the Western Mongol forces were effectively cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Yet the threat was far from over. Batu, refusing to relinquish his hold, declared himself independent Khan of the Western Khanate, a ruler not beholden to the fractured empire to the east. His ambitions now focused on consolidating power in Europe, but the cost was constant war. Europe, fractured but defiant, stood at a crossroads. Would the Continental Pact survive to reshape the continent? Would the Mongol Khanate fragment into warring factions that would bleed the land dry? Or would a new empire rise from the ashes, one born not of conquest, but of compromise and adaptation? In the shadows of these questions, a final player moved. Frederick II, sensing his moment slipping, made a desperate gamble. He sought alliance with the papacy and the mercenary orders, promising lands and titles in exchange for one last push against Charles and the Pact. The stage was set for a final reckoning, and beneath the rising sun of 1229, armies began to march, not just for Paris, but for the soul of Europe itself. The year 1229 opened beneath a sky heavy with expectation and dread. Europe was a land rent by war, diplomacy, and ideology, a continent fighting for its very soul. At the heart of the storm stood Paris, battered but unbroken, the fortress city that had become the crucible of a new world. Charles of Anjou, still recovering from his wounds, understood the stakes. He was not just defending a city, he was defending a vision. A Europe united not by kings or popes, but by a pact of free cities, shared governance, and resilience. Frederick II, meanwhile, had consolidated power in the south. With papal blessing renewed, though grudging, and the support of mercenary orders, he launched a campaign to reclaim lost territories and crush the Continental Pact. His armies, seasoned by years of internal conflict, moved northward with determination. Batu Khan, isolated from Karakoram's fracturing politics but fiercely ambitious, sought to reassert Mongol dominance. His forces regrouped along the Rhine, fortifying key cities and preparing for a renewed offensive. Yet beneath these titanic struggles, something unexpected began to emerge. In the free cities, the principles of the pact began to take root. Governance was no longer dictated solely by birthright or divine decree. Councils formed representing merchants, artisans, clergy, and peasants alike. Trade networks flourished under mutual protection. Ideas, technology, and culture flowed with unprecedented freedom. It was a renaissance before its time. But war would not wait for peace to bloom. The Battle of Reims, fought in late spring, became the defining moment of this era. Frederick's forces, bolstered by papal knights and imperial levies, faced the Pact's coalition army, a diverse force of Norse warriors, French knights, Flemish pikemen, and even former Mongol auxiliaries who had defected. The clash was savage. Cavalry charges thundered against spear walls. Archers battled crossbowmen in volleys of death. Siege engines hurled fire and stone across the fields. The ground was churned to mud, and rivers ran red. In the midst of chaos, Charles was wounded again, this time severely. Yet the Pact's forces, inspired by his leadership and Aveline de Carnac's stirring proclamations, refused to break. Slowly, they turned the tide. Frederick's army faltered. Desertions grew. His papal support waned as news of massacres committed by his troops spread. The mercenary orders, seeing the tide shifting, withdrew from the campaign. Batu Khan, hearing of the defeat from his fortress along the Rhine, was forced to reconsider his strategy. The Mongol forces in Europe were stretched thin. Rebellion simmered among conscripted Europeans. The Eastern Mongol Empire offered no aid. In a council beneath the moonlight, Batu made a choice. He would negotiate. The Treaty of Metz, signed in the summer of 1230, redrew Europe's map once more. The pact was recognized as a sovereign entity, a confederation of free cities with the right to self-governance and mutual defense. Frederick II retained his southern domains, but was forced to swear fealty to the pact's principles. Batu withdrew to Hungary, maintaining control over a reduced Mongol enclave, but renouncing ambitions of full conquest. Europe breathed, tentatively. The consequences were profound. The Charter of the Free Cities became a foundation for modern democracy, influencing governance far beyond the continent. The integration of Mongol administrative techniques introduced efficiencies that accelerated trade and communication. Religious tolerance, though imperfect, laid early groundwork for pluralism. And the Mongol Empire, fractured and humbled, transformed from conqueror to participant in European affairs. The legacy of Genghis Khan's westward march was not destruction alone, but transformation. And in the shadows of this altered history, one wonders, had Genghis Khan attacked Western Europe instead of China? Would our modern world have been born centuries earlier? Would the clash of East and West have forced unity, innovation, and governance beyond anything known before? Or would the fires of conquest have consumed us all? The aftermath of the Treaty of Metz rippled far beyond the battlefield. Europe, scarred and exhausted, was awakening to a new reality forged in fire and blood, a reality where old certainties no longer held sway. Charles of Anjou, though weakened by his injuries, rose as the first leader of this nascent confederation of free cities. His vision extended beyond mere survival. He dreamed of a Europe united by commerce, knowledge, and shared governance rather than feudal obligation. Under his guidance, the pact began codifying laws that balanced local autonomy with collective security. City councils gained authority to regulate markets, enforce justice, and raise militias. Trade flourished along the Rhine and Seine, linking once fractured regions with new roads and safer rivers. The Mongol presence, while diminished, became a complex thread woven into the fabric of this changing Europe. Batu Khan's successor, his son, known as Kublai, embraced diplomacy over conquest. Though still holding sway over parts of Hungary and Austria, the Mongol rulers began adopting European customs, intermarrying with nobility, and sponsoring cultural exchanges. The hybridization of East and West created a fertile ground for innovation. Scholars traveled between Karakorum and Paris, exchanging manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Mongol postal systems inspired more efficient communication networks in European cities. Artisans introduced silk weaving techniques and paper-making processes learned from Asia, transforming economies and crafts. Yet, this period of fragile peace was not without tension. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile the expanded cultural exchange with doctrine. The Church, though weakened, fought to maintain influence, pushing for orthodoxy even as heresy and pluralism spread. In distant monasteries, debates raged over the role of secular governance and tolerance. Meanwhile, the memory of the Mongol invasions lingered like a shadow over the continent. Many feared the resurgence of the Great Khan's heirs or new waves of nomadic armies from the steppes. Border fortifications were expanded. Militias drilled constantly. But the greater threat was internal. Factions within the pact vied for dominance. Merchants against nobles, city-states against rural lords. Political intrigue became a constant undercurrent. Assassinations, betrayals, and conspiracies tested the fragile alliance. Amid this complexity rose a new figure, Aveline de Carnac. The young woman whose writings had inspired rebellion became a leading voice in the evolving political landscape. She championed the rights of commoners, the importance of education, and the necessity of religious tolerance. Her speeches ignited movements for representation in city councils and inspired reforms across the continent. But Aveline's influence was not without enemies. Conservative factions branded her a heretic and traitor. Attempts on her life forced her into hiding multiple times. Yet her ideas endured, circulating in secret, planting seeds of revolution. Far to the east, the Mongol Empire was undergoing its own transformation. The Great Khan's successors faced the challenge of governing an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Europe. Fragmentation loomed, but so did opportunity. The exchange with Europe offered new paths, to diplomacy, to trade, to cultural blending. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols were no longer just conquerors. They were statesmen, merchants, and patrons of the arts. In this altered timeline, the collision of East and West sparked an early Renaissance, centuries ahead of history's clock. The blending of traditions, technologies, and ideas created a mosaic of cultures that shaped the development of science, governance, and art. And yet, as Europe moved forward, the question remained, had the shadow of the Mongol horde brought about salvation or simply delayed inevitable conflict? Would this fragile peace endure, or would new wars rise from the ashes of old empires? As the 13th century unfolded, the world stood transformed by a cascade of choices, battles, and alliances born from a single pivotal divergence. Genghis Khan's decision to strike west instead of east. Europe, shattered and remade, had become a mosaic of free cities, hybrid cultures, and evolving governments. The Mongol Empire, once a relentless tide of conquest, had settled into a force both feared and respected. its legacy etched into the political and cultural landscape of the continent. The Charter of the Free Cities had inspired a new form of governance that sowed the seeds of democracy centuries before its time. Ideas of representation, shared sovereignty, and religious tolerance spread through bustling marketplaces and quiet monasteries alike. The melding of Mongol administrative discipline with European innovation accelerated trade and communication, shrinking distances and expanding horizons. Yet beneath this progress lurked the fragile tension between unity and division. Old loyalties persisted between church and state, city and crown, east and west. The scars of war had not fully healed, and new factions jockeyed for influence in the halls of power. Assassinations and uprisings were common, reminding all that peace was a negotiation, not a guarantee. In the courts of Paris and Karakorum, letters flew back and forth, formal and informal, binding rulers in a web of diplomacy and fragile trust. The Mongol rulers, once feared as destroyers, now sought recognition as legitimate partners in an increasingly interconnected world. But what if this world, the one forged by conquest redirected, had never come to be? Would the relentless march of the Mongol hordes across China, their brutal campaigns against the Jin and Song dynasties, have shaped Asia into the dominant world power far earlier? Would the cultural and technological exchanges sparked by Eurasian conquest have taken a different path, perhaps delaying the Renaissance or shifting it eastward? Would Europe have remained fractured and vulnerable, its kingdoms locked in endless internecine conflict, waiting centuries longer to embrace the ideals of governance and unity? History is a tapestry woven from countless threads of possibility. The choice of a single leader, the turning of a horse, the whisper of a strategy, all ripple outward, shaping destinies in ways seen and unseen. If Genghis Khan had marched westward, Europe would have faced devastation, yes, but also rebirth. The collision of East and West might have accelerated the birth of a modern world. It might have forced the fusion of cultures, laws, and ideas centuries before they otherwise emerged. Would you have wanted to live in such a world? One forged in fire, forged in blood, but tempered by innovation and resilience? A world where the old order was shattered, and a new order, fragile, tumultuous, yet brimming with possibility, was born? The answer lies in the echoes of history and the stories we choose to tell. Thank you for journeying through this alternate path of our shared past. If this exploration stirred your curiosity or imagination, please share your thoughts below. What do you think the world would look like today if Genghis Khan had truly attacked Western Europe? How might our politics, cultures, and societies be different? Let's continue this conversation together.